Mr. President,
Senator for New Jersey.
I stand here today with a sobered heart. I'm a big believer that if America hasn't broken your heart, you probably don't love her enough. We are here on the one-year anniversary of one of our great nation's moments of shame. We saw a violent attack on this Capitol, ignited and incited by demagogues who were trying to spread a lie, telling people their votes were stolen by a president who broke with our traditions of a peaceful transfer of power and told his supporters to come to this building. And on that day, that vicious attack, we saw heroic actions by men and women who stood in the breach to try to protect the 535 members of Congress, their staffs, the people in this body that do so much good to keep this nation's traditions moving. And as a result of that conflict, lives were lost. Brian Sicknick from my state died as a result of his injuries. And the feelings of that day are still with me. I was sitting right here next to friends and colleagues as we were told to stay in our seats, as we were told that the Capitol was under attack. I watched the basic decency of people in this room as staffers came in tears and in pain, and the comforting I saw of some of my colleagues and watching other staff members protecting historic artifacts, protecting the very boxes that would ensure that our tradition would continue, that here on this earth, a nation would be formed that values the highest ideals of humanity, that the people can come together and form amongst them a system of government. We were escorted out that door. And I think the gravity of it really hit me when we came right out that door, and one of the first things I saw was an officer down. I rushed over and I said, "What happened?" And he said, I was hit. And then all along our retreat, in that ignominious moment, all along that retreat, we saw officers injured. I eventually walked and worked my way to my office. And I will never forget this moment as long as I live. I feel not just my own pain, but I thought immediately of my dad. And I felt the pain of my ancestors, because when I turned on that screen, the very first thing I saw was the Confederate flag. And it all came rushing to my heart. And I felt an ache and a hurt. My heart was broken. I know that day shocked a lot of people. But when I saw that flag, it connected to a current, the dark eddies of our nation's history that have been persistent because violent mobs from the beginning of our country have tried to stop our democratic traditions. That flag in so many communities in this country, carried by Klansmen, carried by those who took democratically elected officials, blacks in southern states, ripped them from their offices, dragged judges into the street, beat them, lynched them. That was their flag. And as I watched from my office, I saw swastikas. I saw Muslim hate. I talked to black officers here. And as they defended the country they loved, they were repeatedly called the N-word over and over again. You can't be surprised. You just can't. As we have always, in every generation, tried to make a more perfect union, this is part of that story of people who want to stop the march of democracy. You think that the suffrage movement didn't face violence? It did. As people tried to intimidate and beat and stop the equal franchise. You think the civil rights movement didn't face violence? How many martyrs' names do we know? People who were shot down and killed because they did not want them to have equal representation. Why did I ache for my ancestors? Because those were the stories of my grandparents. Those were the stories of my father, of the fear and the intimidation of just trying to exercise your franchise. Why are we surprised by demagoguery and hate in our nation? It is a part of our story, but the greatness of our country is not that that existed, but the good people who have come together in every generation and said, not on our watch, we are better than this. We will pull together out of the great, vast diversity of our nation a rainbow coalition of people dedicated not to a race or a religion, but to a national ideal. I am here as a senator, just the fourth black person ever elected popularly in our nation's history. I am here because white folks and black folks and Asian folks and all Americans didn't just hope for a better democracy, didn't just condemn violence. They worked to preserve and protect and advance our nation. And what are we doing now? Is this going to be a day where we just condemn what happened? Is this just going to be a day where we point fingers of blame and feel good in our contempt for those who are at the core of that? If that's what this day is about, it is for naught. Because we fail then to recognize this is not about a day. This was not one day. It was not one moment. It is a part of our story. And the threads continue. How can we be blind to the violence that continues since that day? Threats on federal judges. We had a federal judge's family shot and killed in my state. They're up 400%. Threats on members of this body, threats on all 535 congresspeople are up around twofold. You think this is about a day when election officials, nonpartisan people all across this country now are seeing threats? Reuters documented more than 850 threatening, hostile messages aimed at election officials. In Philadelphia, a Republican who dared to tell the truth about the election, mirroring the words of then President Donald Trump's highest officials that the election was fair. What happened to him? Threats and intimidations, people calling his home, literally threatening to murder his 3 children. You think this is about one day in time? A survey from the Brennan Center for Justice in April of 2021 found that 1 in 3 U.S. American election officials feel unsafe because of their job, and about 20% listed threats to their lives as a job-related concern. This is not a foreign country. This is the United States of America, and our election officials, nonpartisan individuals, Republican, Democrat, fellow Americans, are afraid to do their job because they tell the truth. This is not about one day. This is not This is a story from the founding of our country, as our founders tried to break with the course of human events and establish here the greatest experiment of humanity. There were people who wanted authoritarianism. There were people that wanted bigotry. There were people that wanted to protect with violence the kind of despotism that we broke away from. We make a big mistake if on this day we just talk about what happened here. We have protection. We have security. But all across this country right now, there are believers in this democracy that have the same fear that my grandparents did, the same fear that my father did, the same fear that blacks and whites who joined arms to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights did. This is a cancer. It has always been here. And we make a tragic mistake just by talking about this day. Because when I survey the United States of America, I am so worried. There has never been a time in my life where I've been more worried about this democracy. I grew up with stories of family members who talked about the preciousness of what it is to vote. They loved the heroes of John F. Kennedy and Medgar Evers and these people who fought for them from all backgrounds. My parents taught me to love people, Jewish people who, like Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joachim Prince, people who knew that in America, if you just fight for your own rights, who are you? This is a nation where we know we're all in this. But I stand here today to tell you, why aren't we talking about the fact that in states right now, laws are being passed specifically designed to disenfranchise people? Don't take my word for it. The year I came to this body, in 2013, a federal judge in North Carolina looked at that voting law and said it was designed with surgical-like precision to disenfranchise black Americans. But I don't need to go back to 2013 to see reason for us all to be concerned. When early voting started in the fall of 2020 in Georgia, some voters had to wait up to 10 hours to vote in 6 metro areas in Georgia County, 6 metro areas, at polling places where minorities constituted more than 90% of active registered voters. The average wait time in the evening for those black communities was 51 minutes. When whites comprised 90%, in those communities, the average wait time was 6 minutes. Think about this for a second. Are we satisfied with a democracy that in some communities says the black communities will have to wait 8 times longer to vote? Is that what we mean, equal justice under the law? Is that what we mean when we look at our flag and say liberty and justice for all? There are states right now passing voting laws to make it harder to vote. And what happens when a working mom with 3 kids shows up and the line is an hour wait or 2 hours late? What does she do? Is it fair to her? And then they go as far in Georgia to say that person that does want to wait, that brings a folding chair and sits there for 2 and 3 and 4 hours, they make it illegal for that person who might have diabetes, illegal for that person that might have a medical condition, for someone to bring them water? I'm sorry, I grew up, and I confess it on the Senate floor, with the naive belief That the stories of my father, the stories of my grandparents were history. That we wouldn't live in a country where black people are waiting 8, 9 times the weight of white people. That in some communities the wait would be 5, 6, 7 hours, a day's work in families that can't afford to give up a day's work. You think this was about a day? I tell you it's about the cancer in our democracy that has been here from its start. This country's very survival has to be faced every generation. Democracy is not certain, it is not automatic. Democracy is hard. Democracy takes work. Democracy takes sacrifice. But as we sit here now, in dozens of states, laws are being passed that disproportionately impact the disabled, that disproportionately impact Native Americans, that disproportionately impact people of color. And so when I go back to the Confederate flag, I saw waving just feet from where we stand right now. A flag that got so much currency during the black backlash after Reconstruction, that got so much currency during the backlash after Brown v. Board of Education. I know it is part of a larger problem that none of us who love our nation and love this democracy can ever rest. There's 2 people I want to mention before I conclude. Both men I've come to admire. Both men risked their lives for this country. They weren't like our great, great veterans who fought nobly, and many of them died. But I hope we don't cheapen the truth of their story, because they did the work here at home, evidencing our highest values. When our founders wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we must mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Both of these men happen to be black, but it's a value that's evident in all backgrounds, in all people. I'm here because of that truth. Both of them were riddled with hateful words, called the N-word over and over and over again. One of those men I had the privilege of serving with. Both of these men were violently attacked. Well, John Lewis was violently attacked as he tried to advance this democracy. He was beaten, had his head cracked open on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, spit in at sit-ins, and he won battles with others, and he came to Congress, and he worked and fought and defended, and Republicans and Democrats supported the voting rights bill. But then it was gutted by the Supreme Court. And may you all have the experience I have, where your heroes become your friends. And I would ask him, how did it feel to watch part of his life work be torn apart and have these new voting laws that disproportionately impact African Americans? How did it feel? And John Lewis, this man of peace and this man of grace, just says to me, you cannot stop the work of this democracy. One generation's gains don't pass on like an inheritance to the next. They have to earn them. Well, the other person is a guy named Harry Dunn. Like John Lewis, he put his life on the line defending this Capitol. He's a Capitol police officer. And when I read and saw his interviews, after battling to save our lives against a mob incited by a demagogic president, he is sitting under the rotunda and turns to another person after being called the N-word over and over again and says simply, "Is this America?" I hope all of us see that we have a responsibility to answer that question. The John Lewis Voting Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, will be part of the answer to that question. Whether a little black boy and a little black girl and a little white girl and a little white boy who go to vote with their parents can see an equal voting opportunity, that is going to be an answer to that question. Every generation has got to make this country live up to its promise. We are losing ground, and it didn't start on January 6th of last year. I end with an answer, an inadequate answer, to Officer Dunn. In a poem I learned from my parents, in a poem I shared an affection for with John Lewis, that calls upon every American not to point fingers of blame to others, but accept a responsibility, not just to be satisfied in your contempt for some, but rise up as a force of light and love for all. I end with Langston Hughes' poem, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, but yet must be, the land where everyone is free, the poor man, the Indian, the Negro, me. Who made America? Whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must make this mighty dream live again. Oh, yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." I yield the floor.